It came down from the hills. 1. Visions. When I'd gone south as a Tennessee volunteer under Jackson to crush the Seminoles in Florida, the terrain and the disease were as vile as the savages and the Spaniards. The Arikara War up northwest pulled me in since I was engaged with the fur trade up that way, and I fought it through till the end. I earned a stalwart enough reputation out there that when the Army pushed west to punish the Winnebago in 27, I was called up as a tracker to range out in front of the troops and sniff out Indians. I'd seen more families carved up in tribal raids than I cared to number, and I'd killed more savages in turn than I cared to count. When I got the letter from General Clay in the late summer of 1828 and caught sight of the money on offer, I didn't think twice. In my mind, the world held no more horrors for me, and the job on offer was just more of what I'd been doing my whole life. The letter was a summons to the tiny community of Irvine, which was nestled in a valley at the edge of Kentucky's eastern mountains. Green Clay, one of the richest men in the region, had founded it perhaps a decade before, and for a time it had been a prosperous little hamlet. The Kentucky territories, which had been so rough just a few decades prior, had been all but tamed, and the farmers and tradesmen who set up shop in the once brooding mountains had long considered themselves safe. The true frontier had moved west with the endless flux of settlers, after all, and in their wake, much of the danger that had once lurked in the dark glens and woodlands of Appalachia seemed to disappear. The past year had apparently put an end to that stultifying security, at least as far as Irvine was concerned. A string of disappearances had accompanied a long train of livestock mutilations last winter, and the residents on the fringes of town were often harassed by noises and half-glimpsed figures around dusk. For reasons not yet made clear to me, the Clay family had come to believe the trouble in their young town was being caused by some sort of wild man lurking in the woods. Perhaps some Shawnee holdover not driven out or resettled in all the tumult and violence of the past half-century. Whatever secretary or servant had pinned Clay's letter for him had scrawled it in a shaky hand, lending credence to the final assertion that the town was gripped with a white-hot terror, from which it was desperate for release. He bade me come and lend my services as a tracker and Indian fighter with all haste, and I did my best to oblige. I rode Traveler, my hardiest horse, north out of my native Smoky Mountains into Kentucky's rocky Cumberlands as soon as I could scrape together the food, gear, and powder for the journey. Still, it had slipped from September into October by the time I crossed the Kentucky border, and the nip of autumn was in the changing leaves as I neared my destination in Irvine. That seemed a boon to me then, when I'd yet to grasp the seriousness of what I'd gotten myself into. The twirling leaves which blew down from the creaking branches that leaned in overhead wore their seasonal panoply of fiery reds and oranges, and I couldn't help but think of boyhood adventures during harvest season at home. The hills here were so similar in places that I could all but nod off in the saddle as I rode along, letting my imagination drag me back through the decades to a time when worries and regrets had been few and far between. Looking back on that leg of the journey now, I marvel that I didn't take note of the lack of traffic on the road. After I wound up through the southeasternmost reaches of Kentucky, the few carts and scraggly wanderers which had occasionally bobbed past disappeared. For a full day, I went north toward Irvine alone, with only wild turkey and fretful does fleeing through the forest to break up the silent whistling of the cool wind in the dying leaves. Being a solitary soul, I was just happy to have the mountains to myself during the onset of so lovely a season, with only travelers tramping to disturb the scenery. When I'd moved a dozen miles further the following day, I slowly ceased to hear birds in the treetops or squirrels in the undergrowth, as if a thunderous storm was rolling into the clear skies overhead, and the denizens of the woods had fled for cover. No such storm ever came, and I spotted no trace of any bear or cougar, which might have been cause for all that quiet. I began to exercise a bit more caution, checking for spoor in the dirt around the path every now and then and keeping my own noise to a minimum. Still, odd spells of quiet were hardly new to anyone familiar with the forest, and I kept up a good pace despite all my precautions. By nightfall, I was perhaps 8 miles from Irvine and, comfortable in the knowledge I would be in town by noon the following day, I settled into a secluded dip between 2 ridges not far from the road. Again, the singular silence of the area gnawed at me. Dusk came and went with nary a cricket to score the night, and the stream I heard gently babbling down in the valley below nursed no frogs or skittering wildlife. Arrogant as I was in those days, I again dismissed the worry which roiled around like ice in my stomach, reminding myself I had nothing to worry about save God and my own imagination. In my defense, I thought myself more than well enough armed for whatever task the town of Irvine had in store for me. A brace of 4 massive dragoon pistols was never far from my side even when sleep took me, and the bulky rifle I had was a custom job I'd had built by a gunsmith in Nashville. It was a double-barreled flintlock, with 1 parallel trigger for each barrel. I was confident I could cave in a bear's skull with even the smallest of the pistols, and I knew well how to use the whole arsenal. I hadn't been offered this job for nothing, after all, and as I've said, I counted the task ahead of me as merely more of the same. Putting that skill to use, I kept my wits about me. I paid close attention to the mood of my horse, and kept from lighting a fire despite the seclusion of the little vale I'd nestled into for the night. I memorized the positions of my weapons along the ground in the dark, and lay with my boots on, so I'd be ready to move at a moment's notice if the worst came to pass in the dark. Without the comforting lull of bug song and carousing whippoorwills to rock me to sleep, it was well after midnight before I slipped into a vivid and fantastic dream. But this dream brought me no rest. It was a strange, tenebrous dream, which feels almost like a waking memory to me, even these many years later. It began deep in a nocturnal forest, silent as the grave. My view was of a great rocky overhang, for I seemed to be lurking in the shadows of a great limestone cliff which dripped with the murky runoff of days-old rain. I had no control, yet felt no need to have any. I milled about the shallow, cathedral-ceilinged cave beneath the mossy cliff, shuffling over rocky outcrops and piled refuse which were strangely visible even beneath the shroud of night. All at once, my dream's vision bounded along the cliff and down into a great valley of dense and ancient trees. Again, my dreamer's eyes revealed more of the landscape than I had any right to see, and my limber frame seemed to bounce and weave through the growth with all the perfect coordination of a sleek fox threading the briars. I marveled at the speed and agility with which I seemed to shimmy under low branches and swing across slick creek beds in the blackness, as if I'd walked these hills for years and knew each knoll and crag by heart. Only occasionally would a creaking sapling or crackling limb give away my position, and even then the sounds were only jarring because the woods around me remained so deathly quiet. When I finally crested a ridge and looked down into another shrouded vale, I spied through the canopy with my dreamer's gaze the pale thread of a winding road along the valley floor. A pause, followed by a deep and ragged inhalation, like the low and onerous sniffing of a brown bear out west, but heavier. Again, I burst into a loping motion through the trees, and again I was swept up in the majestic spectacle of my effortless progress. Down and down I wove, and at length I came upon a rough outcrop of stone atop a hill overlooking a dip in the landscape, one which, for the first time, struck me as strangely familiar. Though I could not place why, a cool fright came into me then. The hazy pleasure I'd taken in the breathless flight through the forest fell away, and in its place, There was only nervous, jittering certainty that something was very wrong. My view slipped down the hill, quieter this time, moving inch by inch with a delicacy which belayed the strength in my long stride. I slid into place perhaps 50 yards from the bottom, hanging off the steep incline from a gnarled old tree, gazing forward through the gloom. Below, framed by intervening branches and screens of softly shifting leaves, was the tossed bedroll of a sleeping man upon the forest floor. Not far away, his horse was tethered to a tree, a familiar paint horse of remarkable stature. Bundled up with its saddle were supplies and equipment for a long ride, and at the man's side were a number of shimmering steel guns, which glimmered almost painfully to my predatory eyes. For the first time, I saw the great claws which braced me against trunks and stones glinting in the low light of the distant stars. I could feel the grimy press of filthy, matted hair along my limbs. I could smell the rotten stench of mildew and spoiled meat which hung heavy in the air all about me, so thick I gagged at its foul caress. That gagging was what jolted me awake, driving me upright to hack phlegm into the dirt alongside me. For a moment, my head spun. I had to flex my fingers and grip my coat, to feel of my face before I convinced myself that awfully tangible dream had ceased. But the stamping of my sturdy paint horse soon broke me from my stupor. Traveler was nervous, and so was I. With the torpor of sleep gone, the fear crept back in, as I realized just how closely the black forest holler I'd settled into resembled the one I'd been looking down upon in that beastly dream. Then the smell hit me. The stink of butchered meat left to fester on a warm, wet day, wreathed in the soggy miasma of mildewed clothing and overripe mushrooms. Now I moved past fright into motion. I slid into my brace of pistols with ease and took up the rifle, backing always toward my horse, which still snorted and shuffled with a prey animal's shifty unease. I kept my eyes uphill and my ears trained as I went about shifting the saddle onto my horse and loading it up with my provisions, thinking always to the last position I'd taken in that strange dream, if that's what it was, above that familiar sleeping form in the holler. How very close that dreamer's gaze had been. Too close. But my eyes were not nearly so keen as they had been in my eerie vision, and so I could see nothing but blackness through the branches which reared up a few feet away. When at last I pulled myself up into the saddle, I didn't need to spur Traveler into motion. Seeming to intuit my gnawing fear that there was no time to spare, he bowled on thundering hooves up through the brush onto the small road we'd left that evening, and I turned him in the direction of Irvine. He broke into a hurried trot, and I kept my rifle ready, the noise of our progress drowning out any ambience that might have spilled from the trees. I knew there was no such ambience, though. Even if I pulled Traveler to a dead halt and held my breath, I'd hear only that damnable quiet that had reigned the nights and days since coming into the Kentucky Cumberlands. The road was just wide enough that there was a small break in the leaning canopy overhead, and that let a little bit of moonlight spill through. The forest to either side was still a curtained midnight to my eyes, but the little rise in visibility out here made me both confident and nervous. I would see anything which traipsed out into the road to meet me, but I'd also be painfully visible to anyone creeping in the branches and brambles beyond the light. Countless bloody memories of savage arrows and crude shot screeching from the trees in ambush weighed on me, and, desperate not to repeat the end of so many men tasked with hunting Indians, I brought Traveler into something close to a gallop, as fast as I could manage in the dark without risking disaster. Whatever was out there, I needed to put distance between us. That's when the call sounded from the hills we'd left behind, low and ululating, echoing down chasms and along ridgelines with a heavy resonance that seemed to me supernatural. It would be impossible to replicate the noise in writing. It was almost physically revolting, the auditory equivalent of smelling a sun-baked trash heap. The closest analog I can offer is that of a hyena I once heard cackling during a fight I witnessed at a traveling menagerie that came through Knoxville when I was just a boy. That isn't a perfect match, though, just of a similar cadence. This was deep, bassy, big. The hyena's cackle was wavering, as I recall it, half threatening and half cowering, but there was nothing pathetic in the call that came down from the hills. If you told me during the breathless chaos of that flight along the road that the mountain itself had opened up and gave out that awful bellow, I would have believed you. It carried the rage of ages and the strength of forgotten gods in it. It was in the wake of that terrible cackling, rolling off the ridges like thunder, that I rounded a bend in the road and was nearly tossed off by Traveler, who skidded to a reckless halt on the slope. Not 20 yards ahead, a figure leaned out into the road from the trees. It was no more than an outline from that distance, darker than the blackness of the forest behind it. I wasted no time. I hit it with the rifle, the blast seeming tame by comparison to the booming call which had rocked the forest mere moments before. It didn't budge, nor did it fall. The silhouette remained stony and motionless, leaning just as it had when I'd first seen it. Keeping the rifle leveled, I waited. Traveler shifted his weight, nervous in the newly fallen silence, but not, I realized, frightened. If anything, after the initial scare, Traveler was more concerned about the halt than the figure before us on the road. The horse looked back as often as he looked forward, and twice I had to rein him in to prevent him shooting off down the road past that stock-still silhouette, which seemed to mock me in the pale moonlight. Eventually, I trusted his judgment enough to let him carry me a few cautious yards forward. With each foot, the figure became clearer. A bear standing on its hind legs, I thought at first. But it couldn't be. No bear could have taken the shot I'd given it with so much silent stoicism. Then I saw the great stakes of wood which held it aloft like a scarecrow, and gradually I began to understand. It was indeed a bear, but it was long dead. It had been run through with tree limbs and propped up like an idolatrous effigy to some horrid wilderland god in the darkness. Its black coat caught the glimmer of the stars, and its eyes were naught but empty holes eaten through by decay. But there were no writhing maggots to be seen in the darkness, nor did the buzz of insects score the scene along the road as I went slowly by. The gaunt bear's rot, if it could be smelled at all, was nothing compared to that wretched stink from the dream which seemed now to coat all the forest. I had no time to dwell on what the bear carcass meant. Again that terrible roaring sounded, and when Traveler burst into a run, I didn't stop him. It was closer this time, and its echoes chased us down switchback trails and up gradual slopes like gloating laughter. But as the minutes slipped slowly past us, and Traveler grew more and more exhausted by our run, the smell seemed to leave us behind. Though I could still faintly taste it lingering in the back of my throat like an unwanted guest, by the time we reached the outskirts of Irvine in the hours just before dawn, both it and the roars had gone. In their place, the chirping of insects and the hooting of owls crept back into my consciousness, and upon passing a small farmstead at the end of town, the snorting tumult of pigs sloshing in the mud along the roadside seemed almost musical to me. For the first time in days, sounds slipped back into the world, and I was finally able to relax. Though I did not know the exact location of Clay's relatively small property in Irvine, I spotted it soon enough. The letter had told me it would be hard to miss, and this proved all too true. The small wooden bridge over the winding Kentucky River bordered a modest little main street, which still held all the simple charm of a frontier town, and the shops, barns, and houses which spilled out over the rolling hill country were scattered and small. By contrast, the manor on the hill overlooking the river which housed the Clays during their visits to the town was a castle, and its soaring white-columned porch seemed almost Athenian in the company of the buildings which slumped in its shadow. For them, it was a vacation home to soak in the mountain air, but to the locals it must have seemed like a duke had his holdings in Irvine. I was met at the gate, for apparently the Clays were anxiously awaiting my arrival, and had posted a watch for my coming. Traveler was taken to the Clay stables by one of the hands that worked the fields around the estate, and another offered to carry my kit to the manor. I politely declined. Even with the soft candlelight of the beautiful home's windows guiding me up the Clays' front walk across an open and sightly field lit well by the clear night sky, I felt as if hostile eyes lingered unseen, and I wished to keep my pistols close at hand. A sharp-dressed man at the door also tried to take the pack and my guns off me, but again I denied him. I figured if the Clays were so desperate, they'd gladly suffer a taste of ill manners. I figured right, for the man didn't fight me on it, and he led me at length up to a guest bedchamber which was better furnished than any I'd ever had the pleasure of sleeping in. I was brought clean water, assured that the master of the house would sit with me come morning, and urged to get some rest before dawn. I clearly didn't need to be told twice. The second I kicked off my boots and fell into the cloud-soft bed, I was out like a doused lantern, my crude brace of pistols safely within reach upon the delicately detailed bedside table, and my rifle leaning against the foot of the four-poster. I must have looked for all the world like a battle-weary Hun fresh out of the saddle sleeping in some sacked Roman villa, and I slept like one too, unharried by any dreams at all, good or ill.